Today is the 12th of December 2017, and we're going to continue this evening with our Pool of Radiance series of talks. We just chanted this Pool of Radiance, and on and off we've been looking into the lives of people who appear in this among these 108 teachers. In this Pool of Radiance is a companion piece to our ancestral line, and it contains women whose information has only come to light in the past decade or so, and men who are not strictly in our ancestral line, but who are important to us, as well as some of the people from our ancestral line. And today we're going to look a little bit into Uppalavana. She comes from the same group of teachers as as Buddha, who we looked at a couple of weeks ago. Near the end, it's the section headed up disciples of the Buddha. I think there's 12 or 13 names, and they're all were practicing at the time of the Buddha. And we'll start just by reading the story again. We're working from Hidden Lamp, Stories from 25 Centuries of Awakened Women, edited by Florence Kaplow and Susan Moon. And we'll read the story, and then we'll have a look a little bit into her background, and then come back to the story. The nun Uppalavana was a disciple of the Buddha. She visited the home of some noble young women and encouraged them to become nuns. They responded, "We are young and beautiful and full of life. It would be hard for us to keep the precepts." Uppalavana replied, "If you break the precepts, you break the precepts. First, leave the household and become nuns." The women said to her, "But if we break the precepts, we will fall into hell. Why would you have us do that?" Uppalavana said, "Go ahead and fall into hell." The women all laughed and said, "Why would you suggest such a thing?" She replied, "In a former life, I was a prostitute and entertainer. One day I dressed myself in nun's robes in front of my customers, just as a joke. And because of this, in my next life, I became a nun and took the precepts. But even though I was a nun, I was arrogant and broke the precepts, and as a consequence, I fell into hell and its sufferings. Later, in this current life, I met Shakyamuni Buddha, ordained, developed great meditative powers, and became an arahant. In this way, I learned that you can attain the fruit of the way even if you break a precept and fall into hell. The merit of receiving the precepts makes awakening possible, but if you never receive the precepts and do unwholesome things, you will never attain the way." So that's our story. So just a little bit about Uppalavana. And again, verses attributed to her appear in the Therigatha, which is the earliest known collection of women's religious poetry in the world, written down around the 1st century of our Common Era, but passed on orally for 6 centuries before that. Uppalavana was one of the 2 chief female disciples of the Buddha. So along with Khema, she led the Sangha. It was founded by the Buddha's aunt and stepmother, Mahaprajapati, but these 2, Uppalavana and Khema, were the foremost of the Buddha's disciples, and they led the women's Sangha. Uppalavana said to be the daughter of a wealthy merchant and somebody of great beauty. And so much, her name means one with the hue of a blue lotus, so her complexion was supposed to be like that of a blue lotus. And she was so beautiful that her father was assailed by many suitors wanting to marry her. Now I'm turning to the first Buddhist woman. This is translations and commentary of the Therigatha. And there's a little bit of detail here about how she ordained. She was born in Savatthi, and her father was a wealthy merchant. And because of all these suitors, he became concerned that there would be conflict over over who would marry her, and that he didn't want to offend anyone. So he suggested to Uppalavana that maybe she would like to become a renunciant. Dear one, he asked, are you able to leave the world? Probably for most, this would be a horrendous idea, but it's said that Uppalavana, it was like as if oil 100 times refined had anointed her head. So it was what she really wanted to hear. But among the many men who desired Uppalavana was a cousin of hers, a young man named Ananda, and this is not the same Ananda who is the cousin of the Buddhas. This is another Ananda. And sometime during the first years following Uppalavana's ordination, Ananda found out where she was staying in the forest and sneaked into her hut while she was out and hid under her bed. And when she returned and lay down on her bed, he jumped out and raped her. And it's said that his punishment was to fall into the deepest hell, the Avicii hell eventually. But it also had a strong effect on the Sangha of nuns, in that after this incident, a rule was made that the nuns were not allowed to go and live alone in the forest. It was deemed to be too unsafe, and they always had to stay in groups. So it was a pretty heavy penalty, considering the value that was put on solitary forest practice. It was a heavy price that the whole Sangha had to and has to pay for this act. The record doesn't say anything about the effect it had on Uppalavana at the time, but we will see in one of her verses that it was something that she, whatever the effect originally at the time, she certainly overcame what happened, as we'll see shortly. After this, Uppalavana did take up residence within the community, and the story of her enlightenment is given that one day it was her turn to perform certain ceremonies in the hall where the nuns gathered, and she swept the room, lit a lamp, and then sat down and used the lamp's flame as the object of her meditation. And this is still done. There's a Thai sect where this is a primary meditation, and so she concentrated on the candlelight, and achieved, it says, achieved deep concentration and attained enlightenment. Eventually, she acquired a number of supernatural powers, including the ability to adopt another form. This is called Bhikkhu Kubana. And these were the classic psychic powers, supernatural powers, the abhijna, and they consisted of 5 powers. And the first one that's mentioned, the one that's mentioned here, Vikubana, is the first one, taking any form at will. And then the others are hearing to any distance, so clairaudience, seeing to any distance, clairvoyance, penetrating people's thoughts, so being able to read minds, and knowing their state and antecedents. In other words, knowing where their spiritual state and their previous births. So these are the psychic powers that she's said to have developed through her meditation. In later years, she was permitted to ordain other women, and originally this was a privilege that was only the Buddhas. But then he delegated this to his senior monks and senior nuns. Now, when we get to the verses in the Therigatha that are attributed to Uppalavana, there appear to be actually 4 different verses that are just run together into one poem, and the commentary on the text breaks them up into 4 separate poems, and that's how we will read them too. But it's a little bit odd because some of them seem to be at odds with the story we've just told of how she became ordained. And one of the early researchers, Carolyn Rees-Davids, when she looked into these, she pointed out that they are quite, these verses are quite sort of diverse and seem to be about different people. And it may very well be the case because this name, Uppalavana, is quite a common one, and there may well have been more than one nun by this name. Rees-Davids concludes that the great Theri of supernatural powers is as difficult to identify as our own Saint George, and it's not strange that her gathas should be composite. And one of the things about these gathas is that they do often contain kind of stock phrases, and you can see the same phrases in different women's verses. And we have to remember that it was 600 years between when these things happened and when the verses were written down, and so quite a lot of mythologizing would have happened in that long period of the stories being passed down. But let's just have a look. We just have a look at 2 main verses, and the first one is the one that would seem to not belong to the same person as the Uppalavana we've been talking about. Because here it goes, and then I can give you a bit of the backstory. She says, "My mother and I found out we were wives of the same man. I was horrified. My hair stood on end, and suddenly the pleasures of the senses were vile and stinking to me. I loathed them and all my troubles they caused. Where mother and daughter were wives together. Then pleasure was danger, and renunciation was solid ground. So at Rajagaha I left home to be homeless." So this doesn't sort of tie in with our story, our first story. But behind this is a tale which the writer of this book, Susan Murcott, likens to the story of Oedipus in Greek tragedy. It starts off with Uppalavana's mother, whose husband went away on a long trip, and the mother found out that she was pregnant. The mother-in-law accused her of infidelity and turned her out of the house. And so she set off along the highways to search for her husband, but was still searching when she came to the time of her labour, and delivered a son alone in a hut on the side of the road. And an evil merchant came along, stole the son from her, newborn baby, and left her. She later then, this is still the mother of Uppalavana, was taken in by a robber chief, and then she had another child by this robber chief. But then she injured the child, and fearing that her new husband would be angry with her, she fled and left the daughter behind. And then many years later, her son independently married both the mother and her daughter. And so this is the story that's behind the verse. And they eventually discover that they're related, and so they find that they're married to the son and half brother, and so it involves sort of incest in it. But really, what comes out of this, we could say, this comes out of this story, this convoluted story, is the kind of world that women lived in at that time. A dangerous place, a place of where you had very little protection, and where we were subject to all these different forces. The mother-in-law who could just kick you out, having your children stolen or taken from you. So in one of the other verses here, this one relates more directly to the first story we heard about Uppalavana. And this is where Uppalavana is sitting in meditation, and Mara, the force of ego and evil and death, comes to visit Uppalavana and says, "You're just a child standing alone at the foot of the flowering tree. You don't even have a companion. Aren't you afraid of bad men?" And this one actually appears as a sutra, a Pali sutra. And in one translation of the sutra, this last line of Mara's is, "Aren't you afraid of rapists?" And Uppalavana replies, "Mara, if 100,000 men as bad as you came all together, I wouldn't move a hair. What can you do on your own?" And again, another version here has 100,000 rapists. But her question is a very pertinent one. What can you do on your own? Because Mara, to work his evil, needs our complicity. He needs us to join with him in deceiving ourselves. And now she's realized this, that Mara doesn't pose any threat to her, really. Mara then says, "I'll vanish, I'll enter your belly, I'll stand between your eyebrows, and you won't be able to see me." And this is the way that Mara works. He can only really work if we don't recognize him as a force of delusion. And Uppalavana replies to him, "My mind is my own. I have walked the roads to power and have discovered the great knowledges. The Buddha's teaching has been done. Pleasures of the senses are swords and stakes. The elements of mind and body are a chopping block for them. What you call delight is not delight for me. Everywhere the love of pleasure is destroyed. The great dark is torn apart, and death, you too are destroyed. And in the sutra version of this, Mara then grumbles to himself, Uppalavana, the nun, knows me, and he slinks away. And these last few verses are quite formulaic. They appear in other versions. But the point here is that she has no fear. She has no fear of the unpleasant, just as she has no attachment to the pleasant. These two sides of one coin. So that's just a little bit about Uppalavana. And we'll just go back now to our story. And this story about Uppalavana and the noble women is a Mahayana story, and it's attributed. It appears in Dogen's Shobogenzo. In the Keisa Kudoku, so it's a long chapter about the merits of the Keisa, the Buddha's robe. And Dogen takes this story from the Mahaprajnaparamita Shastra, which is attributed to Nagarjuna. It's a commentary on the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And Nagarjuna is said to be the writer and compiler of this commentary, and of course he appears in our ancestral line. And Dogen picks out this story and retells it in his Keisa Kudoku. People probably, some of you may have heard of Nagarjuna. He's behind a lot of the Mahayana Sutras, and the legend is that he received these sutras that were too advanced for people at the time of the Buddha, and they'd been entrusted to these serpent deities, and then they were brought forth. These deities lived under the oceans and were brought forth and passed to Nagarjuna, whose name has got the word for serpent in it, Naga, around the about 150 to 250 of our Common Era. It's an important point to think of these sutras coming from these serpents in the depths of the seas and under the earth, a little bit like they were brought forth from the unconscious, or from the wisdom of the earth for us. But here we just get this little snippet of a story, and we'll just read it again here. The nun Uppalavana was a disciple of the Buddha. She visited the home of some noble young women and encouraged them to become nuns. They responded, "We are young and beautiful and full of life. It would be hard for us to keep the precepts." And of course for monks and nuns there's many, many precepts, hundreds of them. But we can also apply this to our own precepts. We may think this, and we may be reluctant to take our 16 precepts that we take at Matariki and at New Year's, because we may think, we won't be able to keep them. But Uppalavana sort of brushes off this reasoning, and she says, if you break the precepts, you break the precepts. First, leave the household and become nuns. The women said to her, "But if we break the precepts, we will fall into hell. Why would you have us do that?" And Uppalavana said, "Go ahead and fall into hell." The women all laughed and said, "Why would you suggest such a thing?" And then she tells a story about being in a former life being a prostitute and an entertainer. One day I dressed myself in nun's robes in front of my customers, just as a joke, and because of this, in my next life I became a nun and took the precepts. But even though I was a nun, I was arrogant and broke the precepts, and as a consequence I fell into hell and its sufferings. And in the original story, this is in the time of the Buddha Kashyapa, so a very, 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 very long time ago. And then in a subsequent life, she meets Shakyamuni Buddha. So in another eon, and when she meets Shakyamuni Buddha, she ordains and then develops these great powers, these meditative powers, and becomes an arahant. And then she says, in this way, I learned that you can attain the fruit of the way even if you break a precept and fall into hell. The merit of receiving the precepts makes awakening possible, but if you never receive the precepts and do unwholesome things, you will never attain the way. So it's a subtle point that she's making here. I hope we can unfold it. Each of these stories has a commentary, and this one's by Tubden Chodron, and she is an American Tibetan Buddhist nun and student of the Dalai Lama and founder and abbess of Shravasti Abbey, a monastic community for Westerners near Newport, Washington. And she's the author of Buddhism for Beginners and other books. And she says here that this exchange that Uppalavana has with the young noblewoman reminds her of conversations that she has had with women who are doubtful about becoming monastics and say things like, I can't possibly keep the precepts, it's too hard. She says their negative self-image stops them from following the path to awakening. While it may sound strange for Uppalavana to nonchalantly say, if you break the precepts, you break the precepts, as if it were no big deal, she is in fact encouraging these women to go beyond their perfectionist tendencies and self-deprecation and give it a try. Stop getting in your own way by telling yourself you're incapable of doing something that you admire. Have some confidence that you can realize your beautiful Buddha potential. So this is really a teaching about getting beyond our ideas about ourselves, and especially about getting beyond our perfectionist tendencies, our tendency to be scared of making a mistake. And it's quite a useful storytelling device to be able to see your former lives, because it gives you kind of a long view on things. She can see that she could go through these very different states of being ordained, being a prostitute, falling into hell, and come through the other side and not be defined by any of it. We can just look at this, at the karma of this. So you can imagine she was living as a prostitute, and then she puts on monk's robes or nun's robes, and entertains her customers. She's in front of her customers, and you can imagine that this could have been what she did in those robes might have been pretty blasphemous, sacrilegious. Obviously fairly disrespectful to parade yourself in nun's robes and possibly titillate your audience in different ways, make them laugh. But rather than being the story, rather than being critical of this disrespectful behaviour, we're told that it has merit. This is brought out in Dogen's commentary. He says the primary cause of this Bhikshuni Uppalavana attaining the truth as an arhat is just the merit of her putting on the kashaya on her body for a joke. Because of this merit and no other merit, she has now attained the truth. Amazing statement. You can get into the psychology of it if you think of this, that for some reason she was drawn to the robes. And even though her activity could be seen as blasphemous, it must have contained something else as well. Some sense of attraction or curiosity, maybe. Attraction to maybe the purity of, or the simplicity, or the renunciation of a nun's life. And she may have been completely unconscious of this when she play acted as a nun, entertaining her customers. And what she felt might have been very tenuous, very fleeting, but nevertheless there. And in that we could understand that there was something, some aspiration, some desire for something more, or some relief from her present life. Sometimes merit, this concept of merit, is derided in our tradition, in the Mahayana tradition. It's seen as being can be turned by us into kind of spiritual materialism, where we substitute acquiring spiritual riches where before maybe we went for worldly riches. But that's only the misinterpretation of it. The Theravada scholar Tanisaru Bhikkhu, who is a translator of many of the Pali Sutras, has this to say about merit. The concept of merit is widely misunderstood in the West. It's often seen as the selfish quest for your own well-being. Actually, though, the actions that qualify as meritorious are the Buddha's preliminary answer to the set of questions that he says lie at the basis of wisdom. What is skillful? What is blameless? What, when I do it, will lead to long-term welfare and happiness? If you search for happiness by means of the three types of meritorious action, generosity, virtue, and the development of universal goodwill, it's hard to see how that happiness could be branded as selfish. These are the actions that, through their inherent goodness, make human society livable. And so we can imagine in Uppalavana in her previous life, there must have been some kernel of interest or desire or feeling that was a search for well-being, for her own well-being, for something beyond her present life. And we could see that as being the merit that continued through her journey. And maybe it got expressed in a profane way, and maybe that was the dominant thing. But you can understand that there was a seed there, something genuine. She was drawn to the robes, which are a powerful symbol of our taking of the precepts. And if you think of how meaning is imbued in objects, where you have tens or hundreds of thousands of people regarding these robes as sacred, as a symbol of the taking of the precepts, of the vows. And she doesn't just look at them or wonder about them, she actually puts them on. So there's a physical component to what she's doing. So Master Dogen goes on to say that because of this merit of putting on the robes, she then meets the Kashyapa Buddha and becomes a great, becomes a nun. And then when she meets Shakyamuni Buddha, an eon later, then she develops these supernatural powers through the strength of her meditation practice. Truly, when she was only a wrongdoer, she died and entered hell to no avail, coming out of hell and becoming a wrongdoer again. But when she has the precepts as direct and indirect causes, although she has broken the precepts and fallen into hell, they are the direct and indirect causes of her attaining the truth at last. Now even someone who has worn the kashaya for a joke can attain the truth. So again, the sense of these precepts that she took in one life, even though in the next life she fell into hell because of her transgressions, there was something there. There was this aspiration to avoid doing harm that now changed the way that she experienced those wrongdoings, you could say. That they weren't the same having taken the precepts. So even though she fell down, there was a sense of there's something being different there. Something being valued, even if it wasn't being yet lived. And we can understand the way that we treat our own raksus, which is abbreviated Buddha's robe, with care. We don't put things on top of them, we fold them carefully. We place them on our heads every morning when we first wear them. All these things are ways in which we are reminded to honour the precepts we've taken. To let these precepts soak into us and imbue our actions, even when we make mistakes. We just won't have the same, you could say, the same conviction when we transgress, once we've taken those precepts. And this is why Uppalavana says, if you break the precepts, you break the precepts. Don't be worried about that. Don't be worried about whether you fall into hell or not. Tubten Chodron reminds us in her commentary that we take the precepts because we're not capable of keeping them perfectly. If we were, then we wouldn't need to take the precepts. And she says if we never challenge ourselves, falling down in the process, we will not be able to transform our body, mind and speech into those of a liberated being. Master Dogen, in his commentary on this, says, how then could somebody, so even if you even get merit from putting on the robe as a joke, then how much more so if it's done with sincerity, because of an aspiration to awaken. Then it's even more likely that we will fulfill our vows. He says, still further, if we receive and retain the robe throughout our life, humbly receiving it upon the head, the merit might be universal and great beyond measure. Any human being would like to establish the body-mind should receive and retain the robe and humbly receive it upon the head without delay. To have met this favourable age and not to have sown a Buddha's seed would be deplorable. Having received a human body on the southern continent, that's the continent where human beings live, having met the Dharma of Shakyamuni Buddha, and having been born to meet an ancestral master who is a successor to the Buddha Dharma, if we idly passed up the chance to receive the robe which has been transmitted one-to-one and which is directly accessible, that would be deplorable. So Master Dogen is just exhorting us to take the opportunity to sow seeds, to aspire to harmlessness, even when that is when our efforts are weak, when they're imperfect, when they're patchy. Just finish up with a little poem by Rumi, who seems to be in tune with Dogen and with Uppalavana. And of course, Rumi lived around about the same time as Master Dogen. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving, it doesn't matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Come even if you have broken your vow 1,000 times. Come yet again. Come, come. We'll stop here and recite the 4 vows.